Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. The Staircase in the Woods, a Climber's Nightmare. The trailhead of Deadman's Bluff was unassuming, a wooden sign slightly askew, a gravel parking lot with just enough room for 4 cars, and a faint whisper of pine carried on the cool breeze. Andrew Kin adjusted his backpack, his climbing gear clinking softly as he cinched the straps. The thrill of conquering yet another challenge surged through him. Climbing was his therapy, his escape from a life that felt increasingly boxed in. He had researched this climb meticulously. Deadman's Bluff was notorious, a cliff face hidden deep within the woods, a rite of passage for seasoned climbers. Yet, despite its infamy, few dared attempt it. The stories were always the same: strange happenings in the forest, a suffocating feeling of being watched, and, of course, the stairs. Andrew didn't believe in ghost stories. He believed in preparation and endurance. Still, as he started the hike through the dense woods, he couldn't shake an odd tension in the air. The morning was eerily quiet. Not even a bird called from the treetops. The forest floor was damp, the smell of moss and decaying leaves heavy in his nostrils. It was an hour into the hike when Andrew noticed the first sign that something was off. A clearing opened before him, the sunlight cutting through the trees in a way that felt artificial. In the center of the clearing stood an old man, hunched over a walking stick, his clothes faded and frayed. "Morning," Andrew called, raising a hand. The old man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Andrew with eyes that seemed pale, almost translucent. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't go farther." Andrew hesitated. "I'm just here for the climb." "Deadman's Bluff." The old man shook his head slowly. "Deadman's Bluff ain't meant for you, son. And neither are the stairs." "The stairs?" Andrew asked, the word striking an odd chord. The man's gaze grew distant, his grip on the walking stick tightening. "You see the stairs. You turn around. Don't touch 'em. Don't even look too long. Promise me." Andrew laughed nervously. "Oh, keep that in mind." The old man didn't smile. "You won't. None of you ever do." As Andrew walked away, he glanced over his shoulder. The clearing was empty. Deadman's Bluff was supposed to be a 4-hour hike, but Andrew found himself disoriented. Trails that should have been straightforward twisted in impossible ways. He consulted his map and GPS, but neither seemed to align with the terrain. By the time he stumbled upon the staircase, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows. It was bizarre. A staircase stood in the middle of the forest, clean and intact, as though it had been plucked from a suburban home and dropped there. Though it was polished, untouched by moss or decay, and there were no signs of a house or foundation nearby. Andrew approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. A low ringing filled his ears, growing louder with each step. He reached out, his fingers brushing the railing. It was colder than it should have been. And then he saw it. At the top of the staircase, something moved. It was fleeting, a shadow that darted out of sight before Andrew could make sense of it. He jerked his hand back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The old man's warning echoed in his mind. "You see the stairs. You turn around." But Andrew was a climber, an adventurer. Curiosity burned brighter than fear. Ignoring the chill in his gut, he placed one foot on the bottom step. The first few steps were uneventful, though it didn't creak under his weight, and there was no resistance. But as he climbed higher, the forest around him began to shift. The trees seemed to stretch impossibly tall, their branches intertwining to blot out the sky. The air grew thinner, colder. Halfway up, Andrew stopped, his chest tight. It felt as though the staircase was pulling him upward, each step harder to resist than the last. He glanced back, but the ground was gone. Below him, there was nothing but an infinite void. Panic set in. He gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles white. The shadow he'd seen earlier reappeared, now at the base of the stairs. It wasn't just a shadow. It had formed a humanoid figure with unnaturally long limbs and a face that was a void, a swirling mass of darkness. It started to ascend. Andrew woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat despite the chill in the forest air. The morning light filtered through the canopy, yet the oppressive weight of the previous night's events lingered in his chest. He had slept uneasily after escaping the staircase, his dreams haunted by whispers and shadowed figures. His first instinct was to pack up and leave, but as he surveyed his surroundings, a grim realization set in. The forest had shifted. The trail he'd taken to reach Deadman's Bluff was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and unfamiliar terrain. The compass on his watch spun erratically, and his GPS displayed nothing but static. Andrew took a deep breath. Steeling himself. Panic wouldn't help. He was a skilled outdoorsman, trained to navigate even in the toughest conditions. Yet the memory of the staircase loomed large in his mind, an inexplicable anomaly that defied logic. Just focus, he muttered to himself. Find the river. Follow it out. He had studied maps of the area before setting out. A river ran parallel to the bluff, eventually leading back to civilization. If he could locate it, he'd be safe. As he trudged through the forest, Andrew noticed the unsettling silence once more. No bird song, no rustling of small animals, only the crunch of his boots against the underbrush. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. The dense forest made it impossible to track the sun, and Andrew's sense of time began to blur. His throat was dry, his muscles aching. Despite the chill, sweat soaked his clothes. He paused to drink from his water bottle, the liquid warm and unsatisfying. As he screwed the cap back on, he heard a faint sound, just on the edge of perception, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Andrew frowned, his heart pounding. He scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just your imagination. But the tapping grew louder. It wasn't random, it had a pattern, like someone walking on hollow wood. Then he saw it. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, was another staircase. This staircase was different from the first. It was made of stone, weathered and cracked, moss creeping up its sides. Unlike the polished wooden steps, this one seemed ancient, almost alive. Andrew's instinct was to turn around, to find another path, but as he stepped back, his heel caught on a root, and he stumbled. His head snapped up, and he realized he wasn't alone. A figure stood at the base of the staircase. It was the same shadowy presence from before, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a swirling void, but now it seemed more defined, more solid. It tilted its head, as if studying him. Andrew's breath hitched. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward. "Stay back," Andrew shouted, his voice trembling. The figure stopped, but its presence didn't diminish. Instead, the air grew heavier, a low hum vibrating through the ground. Then it spoke. The voice was a guttural rasp, a language Andrew couldn't understand. Yet the meaning was clear. "Climb." Andrew bolted, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic. Branches whipped at his face. Roots threatened to trip him, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. The forest seemed to twist around him, the trees closing ranks, guiding him back toward the staircase. No matter how far he ran, it was always there, looming in the distance, waiting for him. Finally, he stopped, gasping for air. He couldn't outrun it. The realization sank in like a stone. The forest wasn't letting him leave. With no other option, Andrew approached the staircase again. The shadowy figure was gone, but its presence lingered. This time, instead of climbing, he stepped around the base, examining it closely. The stone was cold, unnaturally so, and covered in strange symbols. His fingers traced one of the carvings, and a sharp jolt shot up his arm. He yanked his hand back, his vision swimming. Images flashed before his eyes, people climbing endless stairs, their faces twisted in agony, a woman screaming as she vanished into darkness, a man clawing at the steps, his fingernails breaking off as he tried to escape. Andrew staggered back, his head pounding. The staircase wasn't just an object, it was alive, feeding off those who dared to climb. But then he saw something else. At the base of the staircase, half buried in dirt, was a piece of torn fabric. He recognized it instantly. It was the same color as his climbing partner's jacket. Andrew's pulse quickened. Paul had planned to join him on this trip, but had gone ahead a day early. They had agreed to meet at the bluff, but Paul hadn't responded to any of Andrew's calls or texts. Gripping the fabric tightly, Andrew felt a surge of determination. Paul was here, somewhere. If the staircase had anything to do with his disappearance, Andrew would find out. He began to circle the area, searching for more clues. The forest grew darker, the trees casting long, unnatural shadows. He found a trail of scuffed earth and broken branches, leading deeper into the woods. As he followed it, he felt the forest watching him, the air heavy with unspoken threats. The trail ended abruptly at a third staircase, this one made of rusted metal, its steps streaked with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Andrew's stomach turned, but he pushed the fear aside. If Paul had climbed these stairs, he had to know what lay at the top. Taking a deep breath, Andrew placed his foot on the first step. Andrew descended the rusted staircase, his steps cautious and deliberate. Every creak of the metal felt amplified, echoing through the oppressive silence. The air grew colder the farther down he went, Carrying a faint, metallic tan, the forest above disappeared, replaced by an encroaching gray mist that swirled at the edges of his vision. At first, he thought the staircase would loop him back to the forest floor, but the descent stretched on far longer than it should have. The steps twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the unknown. Time became meaningless. Minutes where hours could have passed, and Andrew wouldn't have known the difference. Eventually, the staircase ended abruptly, spilling out into an alien landscape. Andrew stepped off the staircase onto the ground that felt strangely spongy, like moss-covered stone. The world around him was blanketed in a dim, diffuse light, though no source was visible. The sky, if it could be called that, was a swirling mass of gray clouds, shifting and pulsating as though alive. In the distance, more staircases jutted out at odd angles, some spiraling into the sky, others leading into the ground, and some broken and dangling in midair. The sight made Andrew's stomach churn. "Call," he called, his voice swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. No answer. Andrew forced himself to move forward, his boots leaving faint impressions in the strange ground. The air was thick and heavy, making each breath a struggle. He kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any sign of his friend. After what felt like an eternity, Andrew stumbled upon an unsettling structure. A circular stone platform rose out of the ground, its surface etched with the same strange symbols he had seen on the staircase. In the center of the platform stood an altar, dark and slick, as if perpetually wet. And there, next to the altar, was Paul's climbing harness. "Paul!" Andrew shouted, rushing forward. The harness was torn, the fabric frayed and stained with a dark, rusty substance. Beside it lay a climbing rope, coiled neatly despite its wear and tear. Andrew's hands trembled as he picked up the harness. "What happened to you?" he whispered. The air around him grew colder, and a low hum began to vibrate through the ground. Andrew turned, his heart racing. The shadowy figure was back. This time, it was no longer a distant presence. The entity loomed just beyond the edge of the platform, its form more defined than ever. Its body was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated and jagged. Its face or lack thereof remained a swirling void, a featureless abyss that seemed to draw in all light. The hum grew louder, transforming into a chorus of whispers. They came from all directions, overlapping and chaotic, yet Andrew could discern fragments of meaning. "Climb, descend, say." Andrew took a step back, clutching the harness tightly. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. Then it spoke in the guttural rasp Andrew had heard before, but in Paul's voice. "Help me!" Andrew's blood turned to ice. The figure raised one spindly arm and pointed to the altar. The whispers intensified, the symbols on the platform glowing faintly. Andrew understood, though he didn't want to. The altar wasn't just a marker, it was a tool. It gave way. "Call!" Andrew called again, his voice desperate. The figure stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate. The ground seemed to ripple beneath its feet. Andrew glanced at the altar, then back at the figure. His instinct screamed to run, but where would he go? The staircases led only to more madness, and the gray expanse stretched endlessly in all directions. "I'm not playing your game," he said through gritted teeth. The figure frowned. For a moment, the world fell silent. Then it lunged. Andrew barely had time to react. He dove to the side, as the figure's arms slammed into the ground where he'd been standing. That impact sending a shockwave through the platform. Scrambling to his feet, he ran, the harness still clutched in his hand. The landscape shifted as he moved. Staircases rose and fell, twisting like living things. The ground beneath him pulsed, each step an effort. The figure pursued him relentlessly, its movements unnaturally fast despite his kingly frame. It didn't run, it glided, its limbs bending in impossible angles as it closed the distance. Andrew's lungs burned, his muscles screaming in protest. He dodged around a broken staircase, its jagged edges slicing into the mist. Ahead, he saw another structure, a massive archway made of the same stone as the altar. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it. The archway radiated an otherworldly energy, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. As Andrew approached, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming in his mind. "Enter, escape, surrender." Behind him, the figure let out a guttural roar, a sound that reverberated through the expanse. Andrew didn't look back. He threw himself through the archway, the world exploding into blinding light. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no sensation, just an endless void. Then, Andrew hit solid ground, the impact knocking the wind out of him. When Andrew opened his eyes, he was back in the forest, the gray expanse, The staircases. The figure of it was gone. He lay sprawled on the damp earth, the canopy of trees above him swaying gently in the breeze. His hands were empty, Paul's harness was gone. Andrew Saturday up, his body aching, the forest felt different, less oppressive, more alive. Birds chirped in the distance, and sunlight filtered through the leaves. For a brief, fleeting moment, he thought he was safe. Then he saw it. A staircase, partially obscured by the underbrush, its steps cracked and weathered. Andrew Saturday, at the edge of the clearing, staring at the staircase that had materialized once more. It was different this time, larger, more imposing, and unnervingly familiar. The polished wood of the first staircase, the cracked stone of the second, and the rusted metal of the third were all fused together, a grotesque amalgamation of his previous encounters. The forest around him buzzed with unnatural energy. The bird song had vanished again, and the trees seemed to lean toward the staircase, as if bowing to it. In his hands was the journal he found during his frantic escape from the gray expanse. The leather-bound book was aged and worn, the pages brittle. Its entries chronicled the journey of someone who had been here before, a climber named Richard Hale. The final entry was scrawled in uneven handwriting. The staircase isn't just a trap, it's a gateway. The shadow is its guardian. But it wasn't always like this. If you ascend to the top, there's a chance to destroy it, but it will demand a sacrifice. I'm sorry, Eleanor, I have to try. Andrew swallowed hard. His mind raced with questions. What sacrifice? What lay at the top? And most importantly, what had happened to Paul? He tightened his grip on the journal. There was no turning back. The staircase loomed above him, its steps seeming to stretch into infinity. Andrew took a deep breath and placed his foot on the first step. The air instantly grew heavier, as though the staircase itself disapproved of his presence. Each step he took was harder than the last, the weight on his shoulders increasing with every movement. The whispers returned, louder than ever, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Halfway up, he saw them. Faces. They appeared in the wood. The stone, the metal twisted, agonized faces, their eyes wide with terror. They seemed to reach for him, their mouths forming silent screams. Andrew's breath quickened, but he pressed on, refusing to look down. The higher he climbed, the more the staircase changed. The materials shifted, morphing into flesh-like textures that pulsed beneath his boots. A nauseating stench filled the air, and Andrew gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve. At one point, he tripped, his knee slamming against the stairs. Blood smeared across the surface, and the staircase seemed to drink it in, the steps glowing faintly in response. Keep going, he muttered, dragging himself up. When Andrew finally reached the top, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The summit wasn't what he had expected. It was a vast, circular platform suspended in a void. The gray mist turned below, and above him was nothing but endless darkness. In the center of the platform stood a massive stone obelisk, covered in the same strange symbols as the altar he had encountered earlier. Paul was there. He was slumped against the obelisk, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken, his lips moved weakly, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Paul! Andrew scrambled to his feet and rushed to his friend. Paul's eyes flickered with recognition, but his expression was one of pure terror. No, you shouldn't have. Before Paul could finish, the shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form more monstrous than ever. It towered over them, its limbs contorted, its face a vortex of shifting shapes. Andrew stepped in front of Paul, fists clenched. What do you want from us? The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised an arm and pointed at the obelisk. The obelisk began to glow, its symbols pulsating with an otherworldly light. Images flashed in Andrew's mental once-thriving world, consumed by greed and ambition. Its people building staircases to reach higher planes of existence. But they had failed, creating gateways to horrors beyond comprehension. The staircase was a fragment of that failure, a cursed artifact bound to this realm. The shadow was its guardian, tasked with ensuring no one escaped without paying the price. Andrew understood. To destroy the staircase, someone had to take the guardian's place. Paul, Andrew said, his voice trembling, I can end this. I can get you out of here. Paul shook his head weakly. No, you can't. It doesn't let you leave. Andrew ignored him and turned to the obelisk. The journal's final entry echoed in his mind. It will demand a sacrifice. He placed his hand on the obelisk. The moment he made contact, pain shot through his body. His vision blurring, the shadow let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into a storm of black mist that swirled around Andrew. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words. Do you accept? Yes, Andrew whispered, tears streaming down his face. The mist enveloped him, and the world went dark. When Paul woke, he was lying on the forest floor. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds chirping. He sat up, his heart pounding. The staircase was gone, and so was Andrew. Andrew, Paul called, his voice hoarse. There was no response. Paul stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky. He searched the forest for hours, but there was no sign of his friend. Eventually, he found his way back to the trailhead, where his car was waiting. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes. Paul gripped the wheel tighter and pressed the accelerator, tears streaming down his face. The staircase still exists, hidden deep within the woods. Hikers sometimes report seeing it, an unnatural structure that defies explanation. And at its summit, a new guardian waits. Andrew. He watches silently, bound to the staircase, ensuring no one escapes its curse without paying the price. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.